At the heart of the Iran deal was a giant fiction that a murderous regime desired only a peaceful nuclear energy program. Today, we have definitive proof that this Iranian promise was a lie. The fact is, this was a horrible one-sided deal that should have never, ever been made.
Good evening and welcome to The World Today. I'm sitting here in Urbana-Champaign. The closest big city is Chicago. For those who don't know, this is the heart of the American Midwest. And the reason I'm here is because Professor Behrouz Ghamari Tabrizi, to give him his full name, is a professor here and teaches. He's written a very fine novel on the situation that followed the Iranian Revolution in 1979, 1980, 40 years ago. One of the most powerful novels I've read, written from inside the revolution, and very powerful as a result of that, and a novel in which it's not fully black and white. I mean, obviously the reader of this novel, remembering Akbar, will sympathize with its victims, you know, people like Behrouz himself, who were imprisoned, kept in awful conditions, tortured, people who were killed, thousands of people were randomly executed, and this novel is an attempt to recapture that period, but without turning it into a fight of good versus evil. It shows all the contradictions that develop after a revolution. Behrouz, very happy to welcome you and very glad to be with you in Havana. Let me start straight away with the novel, because quite frankly, I haven't read a novel which is so detailed about the immediate aftermath of a revolution, the Iranian Revolution. But the quality of your novel, as far as I'm concerned, is it's written from the inside. It's written from within Tehran at a very critical phase for the revolution. What made you write this as a fiction rather than as a non-fiction work of political sociology or a narrative history?
First, let me thank you for inviting me for this conversation. The novel, I always thought that what was lacking in revisiting the Iranian Revolution was a sense of how things unfolded on a sort of an ordinary sense, on the everyday kind of life. And I found it very difficult to engage those type of moments in a scholarly work. And I thought that it would be much better, and it allows me to get into the imaginary world of these participants without worrying about whether I'm accurate about this moment or not accurate about that moment, but rather to capture the essence of the moment, the spirit of the moment. And I thought that, of course, the post-revolutionary time in Iran, the time that people call the reign of terror, in one sense offered a very extreme moment of this kind of delving into your own spirit to find the moment of solace, the moment of reflection under very, very extreme circumstances. And I like the way you introduced the novel, that to move beyond this idea of black and white, good characters, bad characters, good actors, bad actors, because I thought that you can see these kind of moments of hesitation, moments of contingency, moments of doubt, moments of certainty. I think the novel is offered me a possibility to show the complexities of the revolutionary life and post-revolutionary struggles without being judgmental, without speaking from a position of moral certainty. Of course, there is a level of moral certainty
well,
there.
there has to be, I was going to say,
Absolutely, yes.
because you're the prisoners, you're
That's
the
right.
imprisoned.
That's right.
And the guards guarding you are the people in power or acting on behalf of the people in
That's
power.
right, that's right.
People in power. And
That's right.
they're very moving scenes in the novel where you recognize an old friend, he recognizes you inside the prison,
Right.
and yet neither of you are prepared to engage in
That's
case the other's life is in danger.
That's right. That's
So
right.
death is round the corner.
Yeah, death is constantly around the corner. And I wanted to show that actually death is around the corner, but you see the different kind of life that is blooming in the presence of death. Those prisoners and those guards, they were also the product of a particular historical circumstance. And if you look at around the world, different revolutions, we see that the same guards at that moment in Iran could have been the prisoners in a different moment, in a different place. And I try to bring that out.
No, that is very strong in the novel. Let's move on to today in the following sense. That was, of course, the extreme moment, the reign of terror period.
That's right.
Of the Iranian Revolution. Lots of horrible things were done. We're aware of that, and your novel captures them. But we're now nearly 40 years
That's right.
after the revolution. I mean, in 2019 will be the 40th anniversary. Could you just explain, Behrooz, the popular support for this revolution? I mean, we know it was there at the time of the Shah. We know it fluctuates. We know all that. But to be able to rule a place for 40 years without any consent on the part of the masses is a very difficult enterprise.
I think there are two different things at work simultaneously there. One is a relatively strong popular support. And as you said, it fluctuates. In the last 40 years or so, sometimes we see like the level of participation in electoral politics in Iran goes all the way up to 80%, sometimes goes down to 50%, 45%. Of course, with America, we are sitting in the Midwest now. With American standards, 50% is
very
high.
Yes.
But in Iranian standard, 50% is a big defeat. And I think it's also a myth that people in the rural areas are supporting the current regime. There are great numbers of people in the big cities, in Tehran, in Isfahan, in Mashhad, Tabriz, who support this regime for many different reasons. Some economic reasons. Stability, particularly now after 9/11 and invasion of Iraq. Stability became a very, very important central concern for Iranians. And because the alternative for them, not supporting the regime, is to fall into something similar to Syria, is to fall into a condition something like Iraq or Afghanistan. So for that reason, even if they disagree, and great numbers of people, if they disagree with their ruling state, they try to sort of not express that dissatisfaction in revolutionary terms, in terms that intends to overthrow the government, because the alternative is much worse than what they exist at this
War and
moment.
occupation.
War and occupation, civil war, massive displacements. So that's one sense. Another sense is that the ruling government is very pluralistic. I mean, often people refer to the Iranian government as a totalitarian regime. That's another misunderstanding of how Iranian government operates. Iranian government is not a totalitarian regime because it's so pluralistic inside its own governing body. There's a large and vast polity in Iran with very, very contradictory interests, from very conservative, culturally conservative factions to very liberal factions, culturally liberal factions. People who are committed to issues of social justice, redistribution of wealth, and people who are for privatization, neoliberalism. So all these people
within
coexist.
the framework of the Republic.
And they all coexist. And that kind of coexistence allows a certain level of latitude and public space for expression of dissent, for expression of dissatisfaction. And if you look at the Iranian newspapers, for example, in Tehran, only in Tehran, 28 newspapers are published. Out of these 28 newspapers, I would easily say 15 of them are sort of opposition newspapers. Critical of the government. Of course, within certain limits. Of course, there are red lines that they shouldn't cross. But nevertheless, it generates that kind of polity, that plurality in the governing body. And I think what allows this system in Iran to go forward is exactly the existence of that vibrant civil society, that people engage in different kind of projects, so long as they don't target directly the state. They're tolerated, more or less tolerated.
Let me just stop you there. The last wave of upheavals that we saw several months ago on the streets of the cities, for the first time, the demand was raised, down with the Islamic Republic. And that must symbolize something that is going on. So how would you explain that? And secondly, how come that this movement, which on the face of it appeared quite large, quite radical, suddenly came to an end? Was it repression? Was it something else?
Yeah. Of course, the last wave of protests happened mostly outside big cities. And that was the exceptional kind of character of those movements. And that was indeed the reason that the government itself became quite concerned. Because prior to those protests, these expressions of dissent always happened in big cities. By the middle class.
In Tehran mainly.
In Tehran mainly, but other cities as well. This time, those classes stayed aside. And these were mostly working class, mostly disenfranchised people, people in small towns and cities who had real economic grievances. And earlier protests were by and large not for economic grievances.
But for liberty.
For liberty, for individual liberties. More of a cultural politics rather than economic grievances. Of course, it was more complicated because the conservatives who want to undermine the more kind of liberal-leaning government of the current president were partly also behind this because they want to create some disorder in the country to undermine, to weaken the government, the liberals. So just a complicated issue.
But no, the slogan of "Down with the Islamic Republic," that was quite amazing.
That's so true, and I think that was totally unprecedented. But the scope of the protests were not that large. Again, with Iranian standard, any time that Iranians rally and march for less than 1 million people, people say this is a small gathering. So the numbers are quite. But these numbers this time in different towns, they were like 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 people. These are small numbers of people as far as the government is concerned. And it's very easy for them to contain these things. And the reason they dissipated very fast, and I don't think they have disappeared, they continue to be there on the margins. And
a tactical retreat.
I think they're going to come back. But the government is also a very experienced kind of government, and they know how to use the tools of repression, not really only through coercive force of the police and and arrests and jails, but also through containment. Containments in neighborhoods, containments in factories, containment. So this is a very kind of, and also very sophisticated intelligence work that allows them to identify what are these points of trouble, and immediately they suppress it. They arrest people and they immediately release them, just to to show that they are in charge. So in that sense, I think that these protests have slowed down and dispersed, but they're still there. And I think the government is still trying to figure out strategically, if they come back, how to deal with them.
Feroz, that is very interesting. That the fact that they've just submerged now. Yeah. It's not that they've been disappeared or crushed.
I don't think so. No.
Let's discuss the other theme of your writing, which I haven't fully read, but the book on Islam and dissent in post-revolutionary Iran. Of course, people who don't know much about Islamic history do not associate Islam with dissent. Mm-hmm. But in reality, it's probably the most vociferous and quarrelsome religion produced in that period. I mean, there have been rifts, debates, dissents within Islam from the very beginning. So it's not a surprise. It's just the modern image of Islam promoted largely by the Saudi Arabians and the Wahhabi current, which presents Islam as monolithic. And as we know, in the early Middle Ages and even the late Middle Ages, debates took various forms on many different things, not just politics, on sexuality, on gender, etc.
One of the most enduring consequences of the Iranian Revolution was the unintended consequences of it. And the unintended consequence was that once they argued, the winners of the revolution, that we are going to establish an Islamic republic. Of course, everybody was focused on the Islamic part, but nobody noticed that once you say Islamic republic, you're bringing Islam and its teachings to a totally new form of governance, republicanism. And then in the Constitution, they recognize all the basic rights that any republic and constitution like anywhere else. But they added a little bit of a caveat there. They said that everyone is free unless they violate the ordinances of Islam. So that caveat created a huge kind of foundation for dissent after the revolution. Because then the question was, who determines
what are they?
What are they? Who determines what the true ordinances of Islam are? The Ayatollahs decide, the jurists decide, the theologians decide, the experts. Who are the experts? So that became an issue after the revolution. That in the Iranian parliament, there was in 1983, only 3 years after the revolution, the Speaker of the Parliament wrote a letter to Ayatollah Khomeini and said that, we can't do anything because whatever we pass, somebody says that this contradicts the principles of Islamic religion. So how do we determine what is Islamic, what is not? And Khomeini wrote in response, he said that 2/3 majority of members of the Parliament determine what is Islamic. Right. So this is, if you say that to any kind of religious figure in any Muslim country, they would scream, running and screaming, because how possibly can you say that elected body of parliamentarians, 2/3 of them, would determine what is Islamic, what is not? Just totally unintended consequence. And I say one more thing which makes it very interesting. And then the Ayatollahs wrote to Khomeini and said, what is this? In newspapers, everybody is claiming that they are interpreting Islam. And Khomeini wrote back to them and said that, well, for centuries we were making the same kind of quarrels and debates in the seminaries behind the closed doors of our quarters. Now those doors are open. People make the same kind of argument in newspapers, in television, in radio. What is your problem?
So that's why we shouldn't be too surprised if within this configuration we have, Islamist neoliberals, Islamist social democrats, Islamist radicals of different and other varieties.
Yeah, other varieties. You know, we have so many different. I mean, of course, the entire revolutionary movement was motivated by a very strong sense of Islamic socialism. And if you look at the state projects after the revolution, they were basically copying everything that other socialist revolutions
had done
in terms of nationalizing the economy, making healthcare available to all citizens, building infrastructure, electrification of the country. I mean, all these projects that all the socialist revolutions were doing, they were doing. So that was sort of a very big part of the revolutionary ideology, this kind of notion of Islamic socialism.
There's one movement in particular when the religious laws were not laws so much as instructions from the government that women have to cover their heads. Was first imposed. There was a huge women's demonstration in Tehran against it.
That's right.
But on this, all the groups, whatever their other politics, remained quite united. And I'm seriously, you know, for me to tell people how to dress or not to dress, like in countries like France and Turkey for a long time,
that's right.
you were not allowed to wear the hijab in public, you know, if you went to all that.
Same was true in Iran. I mean, the women were forced to take a hijab. Yeah.
Okay, but that is wrong too.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's equally wrong what happened in Saudi Arabia and Iran of forcing women to wear them when many of them didn't particularly want to. Why the insistence on this? I mean, Saudi Arabia is a different universe. I don't discuss it today. But in Iran, with its culture, with its long pre-Islamic tradition, what was the need to do it?
No, it was obviously, I think that was one of the most important miscalculations that Khomeini made. Because we need to remember that Khomeini was very marginal within the clerical establishment. And when he came to power in 1979, that was his gesture towards the more conservative establishment of the clerical establishment in Iran, to appease them, to say that, no, I'm serious about this implementing Islamic rules and regulations. And even then, a number of his close advisors, like Ayatollah Tariq Ali, Ayatollah Montazeri, all they said, "What are you doing? You know, this is not what the revolution was all about." And he did that despite the advice of his close allies.
It was a mistake.
It was a mistake. It was a total mistake, and I think they realized that, but very late, because then once you establish that regulation, it's very difficult to go back to.
Behrouz, let's go to foreign policy now, because of course the formation of the Iranian Republic was seen as a big blow for imperialism, which of course it was. I mean, objectively it lost a huge base in Iran, and it was seen that they couldn't defend the Shah, who collapsed very, very rapidly. But then the clerical leadership defended its own interests, like the war against Iraq. They made it clear to the Americans through different channels that they were not going to intervene against the war. In the war against the Taliban, both of their enemies, so, you know, Saddam had invaded them in an attempt to topple the republic on the say-so of the West, basically. And the Taliban had denounced in the most vicious language Shiaism and anything to do with it, and denounced them as heretics, people who weren't really Muslim. So I understand all that, but it's ironic that the United States, which without the tacit support of Iran in both Iraq and Afghanistan, still continued to regard Iran as, one of the big enemies.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, we know for a fact that without Iranian assistance, the U.S. could not topple the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. And Iraqi situation is the same. But the main question for the U.S. foreign policy is the question of sovereignty for Iran. The U.S. cannot tolerate a large, influential country like Iran to have independence in its strategic planning and regional interests. And that's a big issue. I mean, and I think the U.S. in this sense is moving very ideologically rather than thinking pragmatically about its own interests in the region. If they do so, actually I think Iranians are much more pragmatic than the U.S. in the region, because if you look at the history of Iranian foreign policy in the last 35 years, 30 years, at the end of, after the Iran-Iraq war ended, you realize they're extremely pragmatic. They don't move ideologically in the regional scenes at all. Like in the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia, Azerbaijan, a Muslim country, Armenia is a Christian country, Iran takes the side of Armenia.
Exactly.
In the conflict between Pakistan and India, Iran always tends to be more sympathetic towards India rather than Pakistan. But it's a sort of a big prize for the Iranians to remain sovereign, and this is a huge problem for the U.S. to tolerate a sovereign nation in one of the regions of the world in which the U.S. has so many different kinds of strategic interests.
Often contradicting each other.
Contradicting one another, right. I've come to a point to believe that stability is not the ultimate goal for American foreign policy strategy, because I think to a great degree this military-industrial complex had hijacked American foreign policy. I think that's possibly one of the explanations, that this kind of constant creation of crisis and instability or catastrophe, as some people talk about,
the former Vice President Cheney's company made billions out of Iraq.
That's right. Because this is the largest transfer of wealth from American government to private corporations since 9/11. And I think the U.S. is missing a great opportunity at this moment to change direction in the Middle East and recognize the significance of sovereignty for these governments and come up with a sort of strategic coexistence with these powers.
And what do you think is the likelihood in, let's say, the next 20 years, whether it's a good or bad thing is something else, that the slogan raised in the last wave of protests in Iran, down with the Islamic Republic, might come about? And were it to happen, what could possibly replace it?
Yeah. One thing is very clear. Iran is one of those countries in the world in which people since early 20th century have proven that they are so intimately engaged with issues of social transformation through revolutions, through protests, and taking to the streets. And these things often happen the way Marx described it, as a thunder in the blue. And I totally believe in that possibility, that thunder in the blue always happens. I think at this point, if you ask me today that what can replace the Islamic Republic, I have no idea, except to think that it might fall into a series of sort of regional wars, civil wars, because the Islamic Republic at this moment still enjoys a respectable level of popular support. And at least 20, 25, 30% of population are politically and ideologically committed to this regime. I don't think those people are going to disappear.
Feroz, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.